At 2, he told his parents, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." And when asked who this little man was, he replied saying, "Me." And they asked, "What happened to your plane?" And he said, "It crashed on fire." "Why did your airplane crash?" "It got shot." "Who shot your plane?" And he said, "Duh, the Japanese." How would a 2-year-old even know that the Japanese were involved in World War II? So on August 27th, 2000, he told his parents that he had flown his plane off a boat. And his parents asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. So after that conversation, his father searched online for the word, and he eventually discovered a description of a USS Natoma Bay, an escort carrier stationed in the Pacific during World War II. A few weeks after James gave the word Natoma, his parents asked him, if he could remember anyone else, who he was with, who the little man had been with. And James responded with the name Jack Larson. A few weeks after that, James' father talked to a veteran from Natoma Bay who remembered a pilot named Jack Larson, who said Larson flew one day and never returned, and no one ever knew what happened to him. So this information was just the start of Leininger's quest for answers. And they began to do more research and also ask James more and more questions. So one day, James was playing, and his mom said he paused really matter-of-factly and said, "Mama, before I was born, I was a pilot, and my airplane got shot in the engine, and I crashed in the water and died." So while looking through a book on the battle for Iwo Jima in 1945, his father reports that James pointed to a picture showing an aerial view of the island where Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano, sits, and he said, "That's where my plane was shot down." And his father said, "What?" And James responded, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." The specificity. So he began to draw what he remembered. Numerous drawings of the same scene of a fighter jet taking off and then beginning to be shot and coming down in flames. And he would sign each picture as James 3 with the number 3. So they asked if he remembered what his name was when in his past life. And he would always reply James. And, they just thought him being 2 that, he didn't understand the question. So at 3, James began to set up his closet as if it was a cockpit of a fighter jet, with eerily accurate setup to real life. He'd even use pilot terms, the parents said, that they didn't teach him. And they would take him to military air shows, and they said he had a really odd familiarity around the vintage aircrafts, knowing where things were and terms. Eventually, his father Bruce got invited to the Natoma Bay Veterans Reunion. I do wonder, how did he get invited? Was it kind of a discussion telling them, "My son thinks he served here in his past life," or was it like a sleuth mission? I feel like you'd have to lie. So he got invited to the Natoma Bay Veterans Reunion. He learned that there was only one pilot killed during the battle for Hiroshima, and his name was James M. Houston Jr. I feel like that gives me the chills. And it makes sense for the James 3, because that means if James Jr., he'd be the third James. So on March 3rd, 1945, James M. Houston Jr., at the age of 21, his plane was shot down over Chichijima, and the Japanese were preparing a buildup of troop replacements and supplies. His plane appears to have crashed exactly as James has described, hit in the engine. His parents sought out the advice of Carol Bowman, she wrote a book about children's past life memories. And Carol recommended that James's mother start acknowledging to him that the events that he was describing had indeed happened to him before, while emphasizing that they were in the past, and now he's safe. And actually, eventually the nightmares grew less violent and less frequent. Now, his parents were just really all in, believing little James. And they went as far as to reaching out to Houston's only living relative, his sister, Anne. And at first, of course, Anne was in disbelief, as we all would. But then James asked her for a painting that her mother painted of the two siblings. A painting that Anne said that no one knew about except for her and her deceased brother. And she actually got the painting from her attic and she gave it to little James, who cherished it and still has it today, apparently. He shows it in the TV interview at 9 years old, that it's hanging up in his room. You know, other wildly, really truly crazy facts surfaced as time passed. Like James loved to play with his G.I. Joes. And he got 3 new ones, and his parents asked him what he would name them. And he said, Billy, Walter, and Leon. And, you know, thinking that these are kind of odd names for a child to pick, they asked why he chose those, and James responded by saying, because that's who met me in heaven when I got there. You know, the parents, shocked, of course, they ran to their computers and they found a Billy, Walter, and Leon in the exact same squadron as James Houston. And the 3 of them died shortly before James did. One day, when playing outside, James's dad was telling him how he loved him, and apparently James replied saying, I love you too. I knew you'd be a good daddy when I picked you. When I found you and mommy in that pink hotel in Hawaii, I knew you'd be good parents. Again, the details. And it was in Hawaii, in a pink hotel, where James was conceived. All of this continued until James was about 6. James M. Houston became such a big part of James's life that his parents began to really worry that their son wasn't living their current life. So, despite the opinions of doctors, they decided to take matters into their own hands, and they took James to the exact site of James M. Houston's death in Japan. They rented a boat, they took it out, and they stopped exactly where the plane must have crashed. And they held a memorial service for James M. Houston. They even read a eulogy, and they told little James it was time to say goodbye, to let the spirit of James M. Houston Jr. go, that it was time now to be James Leininger, that he had a life to live now, here. And in the video, I actually watched the video footage. They have the home camera footage of them on the boat. James begins to weep, like really crying. He's holding a bouquet of flowers and weep and weep. And he's grieving his past life, they said. And then he does this big ceremonious kind of toss of the bouquet of flowers into the ocean. And apparently James lets go of his past life. And his parents said that he looked different when they got off the boat, that he truly had let something go and moved on. He seemed younger, more playful, that he was lighter. So now today, James is about 24, and he says that he doesn't have any specific memories of his past life anymore, that he's just James, but that he knows that there's a piece of the spirit of James Houston still with him. Jim Tucker, a psychologist who works in the division, has said that consciousness can exist at times separate from a functioning brain. And if you look at the best cases of these children, it provides evidence that there can be this carryover of memory and emotions from one life and then continue on in another. Tucker studied James's case really intently, and I actually found the actual case study. And the facts are really astounding to see laid out in the way he did. Tucker says that James's case is so special because most of the identified past life cases have occurred in places where people already believe in reincarnation. You know, some have suggested that social and cultural issues are critical factors in producing the phenomenon. But James grew up in a culture where his parents and much of the world around him didn't believe in past lives. Then the main question is, how? How then? If it's not fraud, and if we're going to rule out past life, how else would James have gotten this information if it's not from a past life memory? And Tucker and the University of Virginia have come to the conclusion that The only other way was if James received this information through psychic means.